Good morning. My name is Monica Patton, and I'm chair of Compassionate Ottawa. Compassionate Ottawa acknowledges that we are located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We work here and pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. Bonjour et bienvenue à la première conversation de cette saison d'automne. Nous avons un invité très spécial à vous présenter dans quelques minutes, mais j'aimerais d'abord dire quelques mots au sujet de Compassion Ottawa. Compassion Ottawa est un mouvement qui renforce la capacité des citoyens d'Ottawa à être plus capables et confiants à s'aider eux-mêmes, leur famille et leur communauté à bien vivre, bien mourir et bien vivre leur deuil. Compassionate Ottawa works to change the way we think about living well, dying, death, and grief. Through our workshops and our conversations and our other resources, we aim to increase the capacity of citizens of Ottawa to care for each other in times of serious illness and of loss. We believe passionately that everyone should have the opportunity to enjoy wellness and self-respect until the end of life. This morning, we are going to explore the theme of trust in compassionate communities. To lead that conversation, I am pleased to introduce Lou Auerbach, an active Compassionate Ottawa volunteer who has also been active in many other Ottawa organizations. Lou has worked in broadcasting and in the federal public service. Thanks so much for all you do for our community, Lou. And I'm now going to turn the morning over to you.
Well, thank you, Monica. You set this up beautifully. I really liked your acknowledgement too. Your Excellency, David, I'm so looking forward to our conversation and to the questions from our attendees and your answers. It's a really great privilege to introduce you, but you know, the problem is you need no introduction. And although I think you deserve so much praise and admiration, I don't want to spend all our time telling people about all the positions you've held, the books you've written, and so forth. It's a wonderful set of accomplishments. So what I did is I asked you if there was anything I should definitely include in my introduction, and you replied that the only important things are, and I'm quoting you here, is that you were married to Sharon, and she was actually, you were her first date in high school at age 13, and that you have 5 daughters and 14 wonderful grandchildren. And then you said, you're a classmate of mine and dear friend, so you can't be all bad. I guess that's true. And it's also true that we did meet in the freshman dining hall at Harvard, where we were both on scholarship and have kept in touch over the last 62 years, but never one like this, which is essentially a broadcast in the company of others. But let me add one more thing I think reflects so well your essential Canadianness and your accomplishments. At Harvard, in addition to all your academic accomplishments, you were an All-American hockey player. That alone is impressive. And you were so essential to the team that when you came down with mononucleosis, Harvard did not do well until you recovered. And you still set a school record for the defenseman with the most assists. And here's the true Canadian part of it. You did it without scoring a goal. It was all your team members. Anyway, David, I'm wondering about your grandkids. I understand several of them have been with you nearly continuously during the pandemic. Will any of them be watching this, or are they too busy at school? I know I'm hoping 1 or 2 of my much lower number of grandkids are with us this morning. What are they up to?
Well, we'll do the recorded bit, but you know, with respect to the hockey, Lou, it sounds to me like the fella couldn't hit the net. Maybe he needed to get his glasses adjusted.
Just a good passer, that's all.
All 5 of our daughters are in public service and just enjoying great careers, and we had Thanksgiving with the 14 grandchildren, and it was a wonderful three-wing circus. We've got 8 of them in Ottawa, 3 in Toronto, and 3 in Boston, who we saw for the first time in almost 2 years this past weekend, and it was absolutely superb.
So let's get to what we're supposed to be talking about, your book, Trust. It relates so well to the objectives we have of a more compassionate Ottawa. And just for those of you who have not read the book, let me just think a tiny bit about it. It consists of your elaborations on 20 basic pieces of advice. And the first 8 are on the theme of making yourself worthy of trust. And one that I found especially powerful, maybe because it links so clearly to how we can express compassion, is listen first. Now, can you elaborate on why listening first is so important, especially when dealing with grief, but really in so many other situations as well, you know, where people have a life-threatening illness or living with a loss, or could be in a displaced or marginalized group. And if you can tell us why it's important, can you give us a few pointers on how to listen?
Premièrement, Lou, permettez-moi de dire merci pour tout le monde d'être ici. Je suis ravi d'être parmi vous pour une conversation sur le sujet de fidélité, compassion. I'm just delighted to be with you all, and particularly pleased, Lou, that you and I are having a conversation to extend those conversations that began in freshman year a long, long time ago. Listening, so key. My grandmother once said to me, God gave you 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason. Please bear that in mind. I haven't been always successful, but it's a wonderful maxim. And the reason listening is so key is you establish a rapport, in fact, a trust relationship with your interlocutor, with the other person. And you indicate from the outset when you're listening that they are important, not you, and you are truly interested in them. And particularly if it's a conversation that has to do with difficult subjects, a situation where your partner in conversation has been through some trouble or difficulty, the last thing you want to do is start out with your instant solutions to that particular problem before you've even understood it. But secondly, you want to establish that relationship where the other person feels comfortable in expressing what's really troubling them most. And out of that, I think, begins a walk together in that other person's shoes, and with any luck, some kind of solutions. Sharon and I are honorary witnesses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's so instructive because the responsibility of honorary witnesses is not to come up with any more brilliant solutions, but first of all, to listen carefully to what is said, to watch carefully how the people around you, the people providing testimony, act and comport themselves. And then and only then you go and bear witness to what you've learned. And I think in dealing with this great challenge we have as a nation of embracing our Indigenous fellow citizens, we must unlearn before we learn, because so much of our history only began in the 15th century, and we have not come to understand there's a lot of history before that and a lot of current history. So that I think the notion of listening and establishing the rapport, that it's about we and not about me, is a very important first step to being useful and helpful in any particular way.
Yeah. I know, I remember when my mother died and one of my colleagues wanted to offer sympathy, and it wasn't by listening, it was by telling me about his mother dying. And I didn't quite get it, because I wanted to talk, I wanted to be listened to. And so I think you're right on there.
Lou, that's such an important observation you've just made. Our number 2 daughter, Alex, has written a book called Inconceivable. And it's her journey of being unable to have a child through natural birth and undergoing fertility treatments that were largely unsuccessful, and then engaging in surrogacy, 8 of which were unsuccessful. The fetus didn't develop, etc. The 9th was, and much happiness, but the surrogate mother got to the hospital too late. She was delayed in getting there, and the baby died in the birth process. And this was an extraordinarily tragic moment for our family. For 2 years after that, I spoke to Alex almost every day, and we never mentioned the subject of the death of her daughter. And then lo and behold, the next 2 surrogates actually worked with 2 wonderful daughters, and then miracles happened. She became naturally pregnant and carried the baby to full term, and Lucas was born on Christmas Day 9 years ago. So the book she writes, the title I had was Surprised by Joy, because, or the other side of sorrow, joy, because she went through an extraordinarily difficult period of time and then was very fortunate to have these 3 wonderful children. But in her book, she talks about the grief that she suffered and how not only non-useful were so many of the conversations, but they were inflammatory. They kind of turned the knife in the wound. It was, oh, don't worry, dear, you'll get over it. Or time heals, just to be patient. Or maybe it was God's will. And the God I know does not wish death on anyone. That's a God of love. Or, you know, what you must do is learn to relax more, dear, and take the stress off. And, you know, you're a working mother and so on. This is all, none of this was helpful. And it was not helpful because those individuals were kind of putting themselves in their own role of prescribing of what they were going to do to fix your situation, rather than just saying, you've had an unspeakable tragedy in your family. You've just lost your mother. How can I help by putting an arm around your shoulder and then doing some listening? That's so key.
Yeah, wow. You know, I asked some of my colleagues at Compassionate Ottawa if they would had any questions they'd like me to ask, you know, and I thought, well, that might not only expand the breadth of questions, but might save me a bit of work. Anyway, Monica sent in a wonderful one, and here it is. What is the moment of compassion in public life that you remember the most, or that most moved you?
There's so many, Lou. You know, where does one begin? Let me begin with last weekend with Thanksgiving, with all of our family gathered around, including the 3 Boston grandchildren that we hadn't seen for such a long time. You know, and I gave thanks to the blessing of being together as a family and the love that was around that table. And then I turned to a prayer I often give when I'm asked to say grace at a gathering, and that is, oh Lord, bless this food to our use and us to thy service. And to those of us who have enough to eat and to drink, let us hunger and thirst with compassion with those who do not, which is a very important, I think, message when we're enjoying the bounty of a wonderful feast, etc., or gathering, to realize that beyond this feast, there are others who are not sharing in it. And what do we do about it? We have compassion for them. We think beyond ourselves into the other. So many memorable cities. Let me tell you one where governors general are not supposed to cry, I suppose, but I did on a couple occasions at least. One is we were in China for a state visit, and we did 2 to China. And this was, I think, 2015. Carla Quattro was then the minister. It would be later than that. She was the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disabilities. And Carla is legally blind and is a gold medalist in the Pan American Games for swimming. Wonderful, one woman from British Columbia. She was part of one of the ministers who was with us on this delegation, because inter alia, we were signing with the Chinese government, with President Xi, an agreement that Canada would be the trusted partner for China in carrying off the 2022 Winter Games. Alas, it's come unraveled, but it was there. And the ambassadors in our embassies and high commissions around the world have a relatively small discretionary fund that they can use to provide some help to kind of hidden gems of compassion and charity and community building in their particular country. And this fund that Jacques Saint-Pierre, the ambassador, had in China he directed to persons with disabilities. And in China, disability is considered something to be shunned. By and large, people who are blind, and this was blind people that we were looking at, are kind of kept in a closet and don't have the opportunities they would have in many other societies to develop as fully as they can. And some money had been provided to the Chinese Volunteer Association for the Blind. And we met with these people who began to tell the stories. And the story that was most memorable to me was that up until 3 years before this meeting, no blind children were able to write the entrance examination to be admitted to one of the important Chinese universities. And China has been administering tests for high school graduates, we'd call, to enter in the Mandarin service, the public service, over 2,000 years, administered town by town, and the very brightest in a few towns would win a place to become a Mandarin. And that's carried forward into the modern day universities, but not for people who are blind. So they provided the Braille equipment and then the tutors to teach Chinese people to instruct in Braille. And for the first time in the year previous to us being there, blind students were admitted to universities in China. And as Carla and I heard these stories, Carla then said, with tears streaming down her face and mine, you know, if I had been born in China, I would not have gotten an education. I would not be a minister of the crown as I am now. And that for me was quite profound, to think of that initiative of the Canadian ambassador to China to begin the process of blind people having an opportunity to go to university in China. The other somewhat similar situation, Lou, was we were in the Palestinian Authority territory, and again, a very difficult community, and blind children there, by and large, were sequestered in their homes, kept in a corner, fed, et cetera, but no opportunity to go to school and develop. And a person from the Palestinian Authority who had actually been educated in Canada and returned working as a police person, but with substantial volunteer activities, had taken over a ramshackle home and had developed a kind of early childhood education for blind children. And we were there to see about 20 little children. There was a little girl about age 6, and she was at her blind typewriter. And she typed out a note, welcome, General Governor from Canada, may I be your friend. And then we arranged for my message to go back that we would be lifetime friends. And the tears were streaming down my face thinking about that little girl. More generally, the thing I would say is the honor, there are about 70 honors at the Office of the Governor General for which our Chancellery is responsible. And our honor system is really attractive because it's non-political. It's the most merit-based honor system in the world. I'm so proud of it. We're all familiar with the Order of Canada, who people operate on the motto, they desire better Canada. But the one that Romeo LeBlanc established was called the Caring Canadian Award. It became the Sovereign's Medal on Volunteerism to recognize the unsung heroes in the community, the people who are not on the headlines. And we revamped that when we were at Rideau Hall. In the last year, I think there were 1,000 of these awards given out. We go across the country in city council offices or the Lieutenant Governor's office, and you would make these presentations and you hear the citations of the people, and they'd all be embarrassed. And they would say, you know, why do you single out me? There are 40 people that are staffing this food bank or Meals on Wheels that deserve it. Not seeking any attention, but just being those wonderful souls who make the community so much better by their compassion and their care. I would get such a lift from those ceremonies, and, you know, could repeat every one. And I've often said, if you want to judge the health of a community, look at the percentage of volunteers on a per capita basis. And if it's above normal, the community is healthful. And if it's below normal, the community is unhealthy in all respects.
You know, that's a beautiful, beautiful. You know, there are 2 other principles in your book that deserve special attention when thinking about a compassionate city. One's about faith and the other's about the golden rule. And I remember you from way back when. You were a person of faith, and And as you say in the book, my faith has made me more worthy of trust by others. And you link it to your humility as you admit, I don't have all the answers. But you're clear that faith has a lot to offer in terms of being compassionate, empathetic, and deserving of trust. And you say, service to others is a central part, if not the foremost quality, of all organized religions. So while your own deep faith is aligned with that of your religion, your use of the word faith is also much broader than that. And your clear advice in the book, as you say to those who might not have it, is to go out and find some faith. So here's the question. What suggestions do you have for how to go out and find faith, and where might it be found?
You know, it's a difficult question in a way, Lou. In fact, we wrote that chapter 3 times, that chapter and the chapter on our Indigenous fellow citizens wrote 3 times because it didn't work the first 2 times in each case. I think with respect to the faith one, it was too prescriptive. It was too much my own experience. I'm a lay reader in the Anglican Church, means a lot to me, but that's me. And the best critic we had is a very dear friend who is a superb medical clinician and scientist. And he said, in reading the book in this chapter, he said, you know, I subscribe to the principle of caring for others very much. That's my profession, but I'm an atheist, and so I don't share, you know, what you have. But he said, for me, my faith has been medicine and Mozart, those 2 things. And he's one of the most compassionate, thoughtful, caring person I can imagine. And I guess the universal principle I draw from that is, in finding a faith, it's really finding that universal principle of caring for others. And I would call that love, but interpret that word any way you want. But it's the ability to move from me to we, from the first person singular to the first person plural, to move from a position where I am the most important person or being or entity in the universe, and by and large, not much else matters, to a person where I'm not the most important person in the universe. There are others, and those others deserve my concern and care. And guess what? When you move from that first person singular to the first person plural, even if though the first person you're very successful with all of the attributes and so on, you have a sense of satisfaction, even happiness, that happiness transforms into joy, the joy of helping others along. And I don't know whether it's in our DNA or not, but I think it is a universal principle that that the regard for others is a great source of joy. James Michener is an author I love. I think I've read every one of Michener's books, and in South Pacific is one of his first books, which was made into a musical. I think it's Mary Martin is singing the song of you've got to be taught to love and to hate. You've got to be taught before it's too late. You've got to be carefully taught. I think children are born into the world with a conception of the other and a capacity for love. And with some of them, it's drummed out of them by their particular circumstances. And so the book on trust begins with the inscription. I'll just read it, Lou, from here because it kind of captures that, Martin. This inscription is to children who offer their trust instinctively and with full expectation of fairness. And I think that expectation of fairness, both to receive fairness and to do fairness, is an almost universal principle. And in finding your faith, it's finding that sense of fairness and acting on it.
Huh. Well, I think there would be some faiths you might not approve of then. You know, another of your principles for gaining trust, and I'm going to enjoy this part of the discussion, is follow the golden rule. And it sounds so simple and so important. I mean, basically, we should all teach and act by example. And as you put it in the book, the power of the golden rule is empathy, seeing your neighbor as yourself and acting accordingly. But here's the issue. This can have limits. I mean, the person we're interacting with might not wish us to act as we ourselves would want to experience their situation, or might be problematic, as you point out in the book, you know, when welcoming refugees, single men were excluded, even though they might be deserving of help. I know, you know, you can just imagine if you were a single man, how you might want to be treated. So the golden rule didn't fully apply. So how do you suggest we use and yet be aware of the limits of the golden rule, especially when dealing with grief and end-of-life issues among people of similar cultures and ones that are different?
Well, there certainly are obstacles in life, Lou. Even with the best will in the world and the best effort, you're not going to make any particular headway. And I think, you know, you give it a try. And if that try isn't working, then you say, well, maybe I'll come back another day and try again, and maybe circumstances will be changed. And then you apply your empathy and your compassion to other places where it's more successful. But you never kind of give up, I think. You hope that your message will prevail. And when it does, great. And when it doesn't, you consider whether there's another way of approaching it. And if not, you just carry on. The Syrian refugee one is it was very interesting. I was so proud of Canada with respect to our private sponsorship of refugees, unique by and large in the world. Refugees are usually sponsored by governments and not by private individuals. But it was wonderful to see individuals gathering together, A, to provide a collective sum of money, but B, to provide the help to those folks. The exclusion of single men, I think, was one of those practical and I think understandable decisions where there was concern about infiltration by terrorists. And the Americans, of course, were having, I wouldn't say great fun, but being quite critical of Canada, of allowing people in who would be terrorists. And there's been no recorded incident of any of those refugees ever conducting any terrorists, and single men were eliminated. But, you know, the bright side of that was one of the opportunities in the Office of Governor General is to provide commendations to particular communities for acts of goodness, kindness, etc. And one of these evenings, we were in Oakville in a large auditorium celebrating an Oakville consortium of private sponsors of Syrian refugee families, about 500 people there. Half of them were refugee families and half were participants in helping. And there was an opening blessing given by a Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, a rabbi from the synagogue, and an imam from the mosque. And when they finished this collective blessing, I said, you know, there's something quite interesting about these four individuals and their congregations. The four together have sponsored 7 or 8 Syrian refugee families, not one congregation looking after one family, another different, all together. And apart from the money, the Protestants were responsible for finding the jobs. The Catholics were responsible for providing the housing. The synagogue and the Jewish members were responsible for education. The Jewish traditions had such a wonderful focus on education for centuries and centuries. And the mosque was responsible for culture and language. And guess what happened? Not only were these efforts very successful for the integration of the Syrian families, but those 4 congregations developed a kind of rapport with one another, which was great. So that was a hard problem that we tackled with the private sponsorship, and dealing with situations where people said, no, we don't want you, or we're not interested in that. But with good effort, finding other associations where we actually could bring many of these suffering people from Syria to homes in Canada, and making the hard decision that unfortunately single men in this particular exercise simply didn't count. So it's a question of, I guess, not practicing the golden rule in that instance, Lou, but for reasons I think we can understand. And in the general scheme of that private sponsorship, I think it worked pretty well.
Yeah, no, I get it. I really do. I just was struck by the, the apparent contradiction, but, you have to make difficult decisions sometimes. There's no question about it. The middle set of suggestions in your book, I think one can truly relate to at Compassionate Ottawa. One of them is build trust around you. And I especially like the one, and I'm sure you do too, be a barn raiser.
Yeah.
You give the marvelous example of the Mennonite neighbors when you were president of the University of Waterloo and lived on a nearby farm. So can you talk about how this custom has influenced you and led to your program of the My Giving Moment?
Sure, I could talk endlessly about that, Lou, but let me try to...
Well, limit yourself.
You're keeping the time on me, old friend.
No, go ahead.
You got the hook. So we moved to Waterloo in 1999, and Sharon wanted to live on a farm. Our children were raised, and she found a farm that was only 10-minute drive from the university, or 30 minutes by bike, and I often take my bike there. And it was in Mennonite country. Mennonites came in 1810, 1820, the first white people largely in that area along the Grand River, and established their farms. Our Mennonites were of a particular order where they didn't have cars or trucks, but they had tractors on the farm. And some of them, all of them, if they had dairy, would have electricity in the barn, but some would not have electricity in the home. Because they were very careful about the choices of technology that they used. And they wore their costumes, of course. The women were all in bonnets and the men always wore hats and so on. And Sharon inherited a horse stable with 6 horses boarded in it, and it grew to 36. And it only worked because of our Mennonite neighbors who leased our land and provided the hay and so on. And Edgar Shantz was our dear neighbor who leased the land and was our guide on everything. And one day, Sharon was out with a clipboard in her arms, and our insurance premiums had gone up. And the broker had said to her, you don't want to underinsure, but don't overinsure either. So do another appraisal of the value of each of your buildings, and I'll look at it, and we'll be sure that it's kind of priced accordingly. So here she was out looking at the barn, and Edgar comes along in his tractor and says, Sharon, can I help you? Well, yeah, Edgar. She says, what's this barn worth? He says, well, what do you mean it's worth? And said, well, what would it cost us to replace this barn? And he said, being very practical, well, why would you want to replace it, Sharon? It's a perfectly good barn, and we provide whatever maintenance as timbers get a little loose, et cetera. No need to replace it. Well, yeah, but Edgar, if there was a fire, it'd burn down and have to replace it. I'd have to replace it. And Edgar says, well, Sharon, if there were a fire and it burned down, we'd replace it. What do you mean, Edgar? He said, well, we would come to help to put out the fire. We have voluntary fires. And when it was out, we'd let it sit for a day, and we'd come back on the Saturday and we'd clear out all the debris. And then we'd organize a barn raising for the next weekend, or 2 weekends if need be. We'd provide all of the timber. We keep forests on our land, and we have our own sawmills. We typically make little hinges and so on. But he said the tin roof, he said, we don't provide the tin, but we have to buy the tin. That's probably worth about $2,000. So you put a $2,000 valuation on the farm, and that'll cover the insurance. And that was Edgar saying, we're your neighbors. If your barn burns down, we're there to raise it. And that's a long tradition in Waterloo County, partly Mennonite, partly spread to others, that when a new person comes into the community to clear the land, the neighbors are there to help them build the house and build the barn. And we could have transformed that into the modern age. And I would speak about barn raising in Waterloo County, which was the secret to the entrepreneurial success. And we had a barn raising award each year for that person that made the greatest contribution to the community. And it was the ethos of barn raising, helping your neighbor in a very practical way. And the whole community would be involved. The boys and men would be up on the roof and so on, sometimes the girls. And there would be always a huge lunch that was a great time of celebration. So it was not only helping your neighbor, but it was a social gathering with so much social capital that even Robert Putnam would be surprised by it. There's one other story that I tell about Edgar. I could tell 10 or 15. They actually came to visit us, Edgar and his wife, at Rideau Hall, Lou, and this was the first, and their relationship with government is a sort of ambivalent one for the Mennonites, because they've had difficulty. They're pacifists and they don't serve in the military things, and they're cautious of largely intrusive governments. Our neighbors got along very well, but they came and they were so taken by the courtesy shown by the staff at Rideau Hall to them, and we took them to Parliament, and they were so struck by the Sergeant of Arms and the Speaker of the House of Commons and so on, treating them with such enormous respect, etc. And it was just a great occasion. You know, they went back home on the train, and in their church services for the next 2 or 3 months, they'd be telling the stories of being in Ottawa. It was just great. But Edgar was on the tractor one day, and I was helping him with the haying, and he had a short sleeve shirt on, and he had a Band-Aid right here in his elbow. And I said, Edgar, that's a funny place to cut yourself. Did you injury? No. He said, just Band-Aid because I was donating blood. I said, you donate blood? He said, well, yeah, I do donate blood. Edgar would be about 53, 54 at the time. And I said, well, the blood donation clinic is in Elmira. That's a 10-minute drive away. It must be half an hour or more by horse and buggy. He says, yeah. He says, I go there regularly to give blood from age 21. And I said, now, how many units have you given? He said, about 125. I said, Edgar, that's not possible. You can only give blood every 3 months, and you're, 54, 55. Oh, no, he said, you can give blood every 57 days. So every 57 days, he would go to Elmira and he'd give us blood. One day, it's about 3 years after that, I was seeing him in hospital where he had just had an operation to remove a fair amount of his colon. He had colon cancer. And he said, you'll be interested in the story of why I'm here and why I'm the prospect of full recovery are very, very good. We caught the cancer early. He said, as you know, I went up to Elmira to give blood a few months ago, and they tested my blood, and a nice nurse said to Mr. Shantz, thank you for being here, but we can't take your blood. You're anemic. See your doctor. Anemic, what's that? And they generally don't go regularly to doctors. They go if there's something serious, and he ignored it. 57 days later, back to give blood, and they tested his blood. Mr. Shantz, I'm sorry, we can't take your blood. You're anemic. See your doctor. What's anemic mean? He says, well, it means that you're probably not getting enough iron in your blood, or there's something wrong that can be fixed. So your doctor. So he goes to a doctor, and the doctor does a test and said, yeah, you're low on iron, but I don't like what I see. And to make a long story short, they tested him for cancer, and he showed the antibodies. They got him in hospital. They did the operation. He was just fine. It was very interesting how that custom of giving blood kind of came back on itself and saved his life.
That's a lovely story. Absolutely lovely.
From a lovely man who became a dear friend of ours. The point of that story, Lou, is the other. When we moved in, I mean, we were conscious that it was a Mennonite neighborhood, but we didn't know much about the Mennonites. And they're unusual, aren't they? They don't drive cars, so they come in your house, turn off your television so that it's not a distraction, etc. They're very polite, but they tend to be a little reserved. Like our first conversation, they tend to listen before they tell or talk. And then you get into the wonderful stories with them. And so, we kind of moved gingerly, but we were dependent upon them. And that dependence established a trust. So we were invited to the marriages and at the funerals, which was quite unusual for people outside of the Mennonite sect. And as I say, I would go around the country speaking about Canada's technology triangle and what great innovative things we were doing in Waterloo. And then I'd remember that each evening I went home to neighbors who took very careful choices of what technology was useful and wasn't useful. Wonderful education in terms of seeing the other, and then realizing not only do they give blood like anyone else that go into the general circulation, they care deeply about people other than Mennonites, and they demonstrated that to us every day.
We could go on and on about it. I happened to come across a wonderful opinion piece that you co-authored last year in the Globe and Mail with Jennifer Lee. And I'm going to quote it and ask you to comment on it. And you said, let's turn our empathy into action and reinforce trust. First, let's put right our clearest failings by fixing how we attend to people in long-term care. removing the insecurity of people living at the poverty line, ending the discrimination against Black lives as a result of surveillance policing and absence of health data, and following through on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Finally, we need to protect Asians and Asian Canadians from being scapegoats for the pandemic. It's simply preposterous and offensive. So, in terms of your comments, do you have some perhaps specific suggestions for next steps that we in Compassion Ottawa and we as individuals can take in these directions?
I begin by saying, I look at you and saying you all are the examples of exactly what Jennifer and I were attempting to say in that article. I'm actually thunderstruck. I'm in awe of what you do and your different initiatives, et cetera. And you in particular, Lou, the number of organizations that you spearheaded or led. That's empathy in action, which is so key. We wrote that article because Jennifer is a Chinese Canadian, who's a colleague of mine at Deloitte and a remarkable woman. And in one of our conversations about trust in business project we're on, and I say the business of business is trust, building trusting relationships. We were talking about racial discrimination in the country, and she was saying, I'm a Chinese Canadian and I feel a woman and I feel I can't really be myself because I have to be a kind of different person to fit in. And I said, Jennifer, what a tragedy that is, that you in this country, Canada, would feel that you can't be yourself with the rich culture that you come from and all that you represent, et cetera. And that kind of motivated that article by both of us. On the question of what do we do, I think we do what you and everyone on this call are doing. The only reason you're on this call is because you're really interested in empathy and action and seeing it done. And you look around you and you do something. Ottawa's a healthy community because we have a high proportion, higher than the normal quota of people that are involved in volunteer activities. Another story that kind of illustrates the importance of this for a society, and beginning with yourself. Mother Teresa was in Montreal some 25 years ago and spoke at a prayer breakfast. I speak at these things from time to time, and a group of 50 or so neighbors gathered with her before, and she was talking then about her work in Calcutta. And one of our neighbors said, Mother Teresa, we're so moved by your work in Calcutta. How can we be helpful to you there? And I, being a university president, Lou, thought she'd immediately say, write a large check to my shelter in Calcutta and we'll put it to good work. She said, look into your neighborhood, look into your family, and I guarantee you there's someone there who needs your love and care. That was her message. Look immediately around you. She gave her speech, which was wonderful, and the 4 Montreal newspapers carried it. One of the 4 was, I guess, the newspaper that practices real politics. We tell things as they are, none of this romantic stuff. Nice little editorial saying, Mother Teresa was here yesterday, gave a glowing speech, and I'm sure she'll be canonized by her church, etc. She's a remarkable person. But let's be practical. She looks after 250 families in Calcutta who are in desperate poverty. A city of 20 million people, half of whom are in desperate poverty. In a country of 1 billion people, so many in desperate poverty. Laudatory is what she does. It's just a drop in the bucket, just a drop in the ocean. And that was a real downer for me, putting down this effort and saying it doesn't count. A few years later, I was at a birthday party, 5 daughters. Birthday parties were big deals. At the end of it, our eldest, who was then 11, said, Dad, the ghost stories you tell the kids? Well, they know they're all fake, that you make them up. And they only pretend to be scared because they know if they didn't, it would hurt your feelings. Why can't you be like Dean McFarlane? He does magic at his birthday parties. So that kind of piqued my competitive nature. And I went to a birthday party at the McFarlane home a few months later. Andy was the Dean of Journalism. I was Dean of Law. And lo and behold, here's McFarlane the Magnificent, a big cloak, hat, wand, mustache. He was doing card tricks and the kids were mesmerized. And then he took a glass of clear water And he held it up and he said, "I will turn this water into wine." And I said, "Come on, Andy. The last time that was done 2,000 years ago was by someone a little more influence than you do." In his sleeve, he had an eyedropper with a drop of red vegetable dye in it. Put it up. He dropped the drop of dye in the glass of water, the clear liquid, said abracadabra, swirled it around, and the clear water turned a beautiful shade of rosé. And I thought, that's the answer. I had been looking at Mother Teresa's drop in the ocean in Calcutta from a physics or a mathematics point of view. I should have seen it as chemical engineering, because when that red dyed set of molecules interacted with the H2O molecules, it changed the culture of the whole glass. And that's what we do with our individual reaching out to the immediate situation that needs care. It has a ripple effect. It influences others to go and do likewise. And that's, I think, how you make a smart and caring nation, a call to service, which was the subject of my installation address in 2010.
Yes, yes. I'm sure I'm not the only one who appreciates and likes your clarity and persuasiveness about issues around trust. And I think it can only help increase our trust in your suggestions for how we should go forward in our work to be a more compassionate city. And I'm also hopeful that our session today, as well as your book, will make absolutely clear that it's not just earning any kind of trust that matters, but rather the knowing and sensing what is truly trustworthy and why. I mean, we all know situations where people trust a leader or a friend, and the result is not good. It can be hatred or violence even. There are leaders, not all of them good, who gained the trust of people whom they lead. So earning trust itself is not enough. And what we want, obviously, is not blind trust, but trust that stimulates vision and mutual compassion. And in your book, you had one suggestion about recognizing a present peril. So my final question before we turn off to the audience is this. Agreeing with your suggestions on how best to gain and deserve the trust of others, how should we decide whom to trust and who is trustworthy? It's a bit of a softball question, but I think you can deal with it.
Well, I'll try. You'll give me a grade at the end, Lou.
It's already high.
You're subject to grades inflation. Blind trust is important. Blind trust is simply not trust. I mean, that's just ignorance. And that's failing to make the effort to be informed enough that you can make a discerning judgment. So in the installation addresses, Gigi, that I mentioned, the smart and caring nation, a call to service, I said, both those adjectives are important. The caring is important, but so is the smart. But do it in a thoughtful way that actually does make a difference. Don't waste your time or waste the time of someone else. And above all, don't go chasing down false paths. And there are lots of people that are providing false paths for us. So one must be discerning. Secondly, be a little careful about inventing it all yourself. Often I have discussions with people, they have a great idea that they want to start this foundation or start this charity. I said, well, before you do, look around. It may well be that others have gone before, and you can join in them without all the hassle of setting up an organization. And if it's looking for money, getting a charitable status, et cetera. And you'll probably find other organizations that you can plug into and do very well. If it is doing your own thing, well, I mean, just begin in your own neighborhood and begin in things that don't require any particular organization. But, with COVID, when people were housebound, looking after your neighbor who doesn't have a car and saying, I'd go into the grocery store once every 3 days, let me get your list and do those things for you. I mean, those are simple things to do. And let me just end with a note on young people, Lou, about how you learn discerning trust and not blind trust. One of the awards that I was so keen on in my wonderful years in university was what we call academic all-Canadians. And these are kids who serve on a varsity team for their university and are Dean's Honor List. And I used to call them two-legged people. They could pursue academic excellence and athletic excellence, and they go hand in hand. I verily believe that excellence in one area translates to another because you learn the discipline and the aspiration. And so we had an award both at McGill and at Waterloo for the men's team and the women's team that had the highest number of academic All-Canadians. And to do that, our registrar would get the grade point average for the students on the team in their playing term and their non-playing term. And guess what? Their grade point average was higher in their playing term than the non-playing term, because these were people that managed their time brilliantly. They could walk and chew gum at the same time, do two things at once. But then when I became Gigi, we decided to have a national award to recognize these academic All-Canadians. They're about 3,500 a year, and I would do an individual letter to each one of them, signed with their name and my name, et cetera, and a certificate. And then we'd have a ceremony with 8 of them, 4 men and 4 women from the 4 regions. And at the ceremony, their citations would be read out, and they duplicated the citations you see of the 3,500. Not only did they excel in academic pursuits and in athletic pursuits, but they were also disproportionately heavily involved in volunteer activities on their campus. And guess what? Not just as members, but they were the leaders. They had learned how to take their positive empathy and put it into great action. And I'm not really answering your question very well, but I wanted to end on a note of the next generation. I just get so excited about seeing these young people that are so fully engaged and learn how to manage their time and their aspirations so they can be, quote, productive, unquote, and do well in a number of different fields. And as I say, excellence in those two, academics and athletics, spills over into volunteer activities. And it gives me enormous optimism about the future of this country and the positive empathy that exists amongst our young people.
And you are clearly a wonderful example of that. There's no question.
Except I couldn't seem to hit the net with the puck, Lou.
Maybe you hit the back of the net. I don't know. Anyway, I think I'm supposed to turn this over to Paula, who will have questions from our attendees here. Paula?
Yes, thank you very much. And I would just like to say, I imagine on the behalf of everyone, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to your conversation this morning. For anyone that has any questions that they'd like to submit, we ask that you please do that in the Q&A box. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, so we will try to get to as many as we possibly can, but we may not be able to get every single question. So the first question that we have comes from Daniel, and he asks, firstly, he says, compassion is a human trait, I would argue, to plan with and plan for in the development of our communities. Beyond developing this muscle in oneself and practicing in public contexts, do you have grounded in experience insights to share with elected decision makers who are working hard to better the lives of their constituents?
Well, thank you, Daniel, for that question. Elected people. I suppose, I begin with my notion of a Canadian Tea Party, and that is the 3 T's of truth, transparency, and trust. To use those 3 kind of words to guide your action, and desperately try to avoid getting caught up in the notion of we must win at any cost, and the end justifies the means for any particular tricks or very short-term approaches we can take to victory in election or maintaining our standing in the polls. How important it is, I think, to stress the fact that people seek elected office because they want to serve the public interest, and their own personal ambitions really should take a second place to that. Now, I know that's a very kind of homey bromide, and it's a bit of a wish, etc. But I think we as citizens should try very hard to encourage that kind of aspiration for service in public life, that truly we're there to serve the common good. And the notion of the individual achievement and victory is secondary to that particular thing. So that's a partial answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Steve, who asks, besides family gatherings in schools, where are the biggest opportunities to have intercultural and intergenerational education and heightening of awareness?
Well, thank you, Steve. Certainly, the schools play such an important part in that. I'm so proud of this country. When I've always thought it was a good country, and 7 years at Rideau Hall taught me that it's even better than I thought. Not perfect by any means. We have a ways to go, but as you look around the world, this is a place that we can be proud of. In fact, I'm just doing another little piece of work. We're writing a book on empathy, so some of these things come true. You asked the question, what percentage of the world's population lives in a fully functioning democracy? The answer by the Economist Intelligence Unit is 8.3%. You would have thought 25 or 40 or something like that. And the top 5 countries, separated just by about 1 percentage point in this order, are Iceland, Norway, Sweden, New Zealand, and Canada. Canada with 38 million population, Sweden 10. All of the others are relatively small countries. And France, the United Kingdom, and the United States are not in that list of fully functioning democracies. So, something is going on there that is quite key. How do you develop that? Well, one thing, again, something I'm working on yesterday is international exchanges of students. I'm doing a piece later today for Universities Canada on our Global Skills Project, an outbound mobility program whereby Canadian students are partially funded for academic exchanges abroad or volunteer activities abroad or jobs abroad. And how important that sense of the world as a whole is. Only 11% of our undergraduate university students in Canada spend any time at another country as part of their academic program or a work program, whereas we have very substantial numbers of students coming in to take advantage of educational opportunities. And that in itself is an important development of the consciousness of the other. And I see it in our 5 daughters. Around about age 12, they began international exchanges with the family in France, and then through their schools and other things and volunteer activities. And 4 things happened to them in their, as we say in French, their transformation, their development as young people from age 12 through the international experience. 1, they became more curious. All kids ask why, but their whys became more penetrating. Secondly, they became more tolerant, not tolerant just in the sense of you're different from me, that's okay, nobody gets hurt, but what's that difference about and what lies behind it, etc. Thirdly, their judgment became better. They were quick to spot bigotry. They wanted more information before they made a decision. They look at things from several different angles, triangulating to get a good fix on the particular issue. And fake news, they'd be quick to spot and to toss out as nonsense. But the 4th thing was empathy. They became more empathetic, not just sympathy, I feel sorry for you, but empathy, I walk on your shoes. And so for me, anything that we can do to expose our young people to difference and to kind of live in it, I think is very helpful in developing this sense of empathetic relationship with others.
Excellent, thank you. The next one will be in French. La prochaine question est en français. Alors, Jean-Pierre vous demande, au Canada, nos gouvernements ont une grande influence. Pourriez-vous commenter le rôle de nos gouvernements dans le développement de communautés compatissantes dans notre pays à la lumière des règles fiscales qui récompensent les dons politiques par rapport aux dons aux organisations communautaires bénévoles?
Oh, Jean-Pierre, c'est une question très difficile et normalement, j'évite les questions qui touchent les questions politiques quand, alors peut-être c'est meilleur pour moi d'éviter une réponse directe qui concerne la fiscalité à ce moment. Mais quand on parle des traitements des dons pour les causes comme la nôtre, nous avons une situation qui permet les déductions de contributions pour une certaine portion de notre fiscal obligation. Et alors, pour moi, c'est une bonne initiative et je veux voir une expansion de cette initiative d'assurer une opportunité pour quelqu'un de faire dotation avec la déduction dans les impôts qu'on normalement doit payer.
Merci beaucoup. The next question comes from Sandy, from Maria, that says, what human resources are required to address equality and to facilitate access to healthcare services in Indigenous communities? And how can we help on site?
Well, Maria, thank you for that question. There are so many challenges for Indigenous communities, particularly those in reserves, and health being one, education being another, water being a third, jobs being a fourth. So many, with respect to the health matter, the analog in terms of positive action that I would go to is a program we have at the Rita Hall Foundation, which I chair and which we set up in 2012 to amplify the efforts of the Office of the Governor General is called an Indigenous Teachers Program. And what we're hoping to do is working with the local communities and faculties of education across the country to identify potential teachers in Indigenous schools as early as primary school, and then track them through high school with an opportunities for mentorship and internships and so on, and then scholarships to a faculty of education to develop educational qualifications and return to be able to teach in their communities. I think we could do the same thing with nurses and other health practitioners to establish a much larger cadre of professionals who help to deal with those needs and coming from Indigenous communities. And bear in mind, what we're dealing with here is a huge education gap between the educational attainment of Indigenous students versus non-Indigenous students. And so we've begun with the notion of teachers on the basis that if you can address that educational gap and eliminate it over 10 or 15 years, we'll be able to deal with some of the other gaps like health professionals and the quality of healthcare, especially in the remote reserves and parts of the country where it's very difficult to keep and attract teachers. So, as part of the reconciliation process, I'd be inclined to say we pay a lot of attention to building capacity within Indigenous communities, and we must unlearn before we learn. Nothing about us without us. These solutions that come from me sitting in Ottawa or ministry sitting in Ottawa and imposing across the country, just don't work. They've got to be reversed. They have to be from the grassroots up. They must come from within the communities, doing a lot of listening first and then in a cooperative way, working on the solutions. So that would be the process approach, I would say. I think in terms of each of us as individuals, it's really understanding more about our Indigenous co-citizens. When it was announced that I was Gigi at the press conference, I had a book in my hand. I often carry books in my hand, which was David Fisher's Champlain's Dream. And he depicted Champlain as someone whom I never knew from my English history. Champlain for me was a conquistador that came from France to plant the flag, to promote the faith, to catch as many the furs and fish as you could and send them back, and to colonize Canada. I was all wrong. Champlain was a 21st century inclusive person, learned a number of the Indigenous languages, established friendly relationships with all of the Indigenous tribes in his travels, except for the Iroquois, because they were the enemy of all the others, and for a period of time, friends with them and established their relationship with the other tribes. But there was a real sense of we're here together to share this land, and we will share it in a way that's beneficial to all. I think we lost sight of Champlain's dream fairly early on, and we're simply recovering it today. We have a ways to go, but I'm very heartened by the fact that reconciliation, I think, is now on the lips of probably 70 and 80% of Canadians, and not just the 5 or 6% who are part of the Indigenous population.
Thank you very much. The next question that we have goes back to the discussion of grief that was at the very beginning of the conversation, from Moses, who asks, how do you deal with grief or loss when said grief takes place at the same time that one just accomplished a life goal or milestone? For example, you lose a loved one the same day that you purchase your first home or graduate with your first degree.
Well, they're two separate worlds, aren't they? The joy of the first and the sorrow of the second. Those losing a loved one, that's an unspeakable tragedy. And so, how can you speak about it? And I come back to what my daughter Alex wrote in her book, and she was compelled to have a chapter that was try to answer that question from someone who truly suffered. And at the outset, indicating all of the negative things. Don't somehow think that someone else can walk on your shoes and feel the hurt and the tragedy and the sadness that you do at that particular time. You yourself, I think one simply has to bear through it and don't expect that time is going to heal it, that you're going to forget about that person and all your visions will be joyful. I think us losing a grandchild at birth certainly changed me. I think about that every day with sorrow. I'd say my prayers each night. I pray for my deceased grandchild. And that's just part of my journey in life. It doesn't get any easier. I guess, fortunately, there are other parts of life that are filled with joy. And in the case of my daughter's situation, having lost the child, then just worked enormously at ongoing surrogacies, which are really difficult things, and fertilization treatment, which is difficult. And you know, life has its wonderful moments too. Here she is with 3 terrific children. And I look at those children swimming in the pond and doing things, and I just marvel by saying, you know, we knew such terrible, terrible grief. And now I look at my daughter's face and there's a huge sparkle in her eyes. So I guess somehow you try to live with those 2 realities, the hardship, the tragedy of loss, and at the same time, finding a way to experience and relish and revel in those moments of joy.
Thank you. I believe we have time for about 2 more questions. The next one comes from Laurel, and she begins by acknowledging that she feels it's a big question, but she wonders if you have any thoughts as to the role that trust plays in relation to vaccination efforts.
Well, Laurel, it's a huge question, but it's a very fundamental question. I'd be a little careful saying about this, but I think if Sharon and I were still at Rideau Hall, we would be going across the country, going into those communities like southern Manitoba or rural Alberta, and meeting with people who did not want to get a vaccination, and go right to the coalface, dealing with the group that has the biggest single influence as to whether we'll come out of this pandemic or not. We've got to get 90% double vaccinated and I think beyond. And we would do that, I guess, and I don't mean to make this too personal, but to use the trust relationship that the office has to deal with people that don't trust that office and don't trust government and have pretty clear ideas that no government's going to tell me to put a needle in my arm. And by listening to them, hope that you win over some and maybe win over some beyond that. Two of our kids are doctors, and Sharon Jr., named after her mom, volunteers regularly to do vaccinations in the clinics and then sees her own patients for vaccinations. And every time she does, she says, would you do me a favor? And the favor is, would you speak to at least 2 people who are not yet vaccinated and explain why you have, and if they have any questions, please send them to me or one of her colleagues, because you have to share that load, so we can have a very non-judgmental conversation to try to persuade them. And I think those kind of examples are the way we win over those who have a variety of reasons for doing this. I had a call came through my assistant Kelly, colleague I'd known who was assisted us when the old job, and he wanted my advice on a human rights lawyer who could take up his daughter's case, who was about to go into first-year university, on their requirement of vaccination, why this shouldn't apply to her and why the policy should be changed. And I didn't provide any advice, and I think I made a mistake, because what I wanted to do was to phone him and say, I cannot imagine a more damaging thing for you to have your daughter do, to start off first-year university, going into residence, and saying, I've hired a human rights lawyer to have this ban upset. In terms of her relationship with other people in that residence, in terms of her relationship with her class, et cetera, I didn't say that, but I think I should have taken that opportunity to speak with that individual to say, this just doesn't make sense to me. And that's, I think, exactly what we have to do with people across the country. And there will be some that we'll never persuade, of course, but we should move the 90% to 95% and lead the world, because that decision, whether I take a vaccine or not, is a real test of trust in science, trust in our health providers, trust in the fact that the reasons for looking after one's own health, but one's other health, are so much more compelling than the risk that exists from reactions to the vaccine. And I think, we're on a good track. I think Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have been the outliers, are paying a terrible price. And we're seeing the vaccination rates come up substantially in those two provinces.
Thank you, Mr. Johnston. I believe we have time for one more question. It is a quick one. And before I read it, I would just like to thank all of the attendees that submitted your questions and apologize most sincerely to those we're not able to get to today. We really do appreciate you submitting them. So the last question is, when will your book on empathy be coming out?
Just been exchanging emails with one of my colleagues this morning on the next chapter in. We're scheduled, it'll take us about another 6 months of writing, so it'll be probably 9 or 10 months from now, but we're looking forward to it. It's been a difficult one to write because there's so much that one can speak about in this, including the pandemic, which has been a real test of empathy in our country.
Thank you very much. So at this time, I would like to invite Monica Patton, the Chair of Compassionate Ottawa, to come back onto our screens and to offer us some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. What an incredibly rich conversation we have all been privileged to listen to. And there are many elements that I could pull out of it. But let me just kind of sum it up in one particular way. It seems to me that we have heard stories and information and advice about how compassion and empathy start early in life. They start when we're children, and we've had those examples offered to us. They start when we are in neighborhoods and throughout our life. And my guess is that if we are a compassionate community, if we show empathy as individuals, that's going to follow us throughout our lives. And it's going to mean that as we get older, we're going to continue to be compassionate. It will help us to live as well as we can, for as long as we can, and it will help us to care for each other. So compassion doesn't start at that moment in life. It starts when we are younger and when we grow up in community, when we go to school, and in all those other settings, not just here in Ottawa or Canada, but all around the world. And we've had fabulous examples from Mr. Johnston about other parts of the world, and great encouragement for our own country. So thank you both for your very rich conversation this morning. And thank you all for participating. I know a number of you have been watching us on YouTube and a number here on Zoom. And I want you all to know that tomorrow, or a couple of days from now, if not tomorrow, you will be getting a follow-up questionnaire, which will invite you to comment on today's session, and it will invite you to consider being a donor to Compassionate Ottawa. So I hope that you will return the questionnaire after you have been able to give some thought to what you have heard today. Thank you all. Thank you, Paula and Jenna, for helping this to run very smoothly, and especially thank you to our two guests. Bye for now.
Au revoir, bonne chance. Merci. Thank you, Monica. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Monica. And thank you, David, so much. It's been a privilege to know you for so many years.
Take care, old friend. Future feeling entirely mutual.